and my name is Mulry, Mondélice. I am an assistant professor of international law at Royal Military College Saint-Jean, and I'm pleased to be here to chair this panel. I'd like to thank all of you and our panelists for coming, and of course, to the team of Elizabeth, I would like to say thank you. Our panel will be focusing on smart borders and the use of technology as new border walls. We will be having 4 presentations. First, Damien Simonneau on smart bordering and border walls. The second, towards the governmentality of smart borders, which will be done by our colleagues Philippe, Frowd, and Benjamin Muller. The third by our colleague Anna Casaglia on epidermal politics, control, contestation, and violence at the biometric border. And the last presentation by our colleague Juan Llamas-Rodriguez, I hope it's fine, on hostile borders and the design of virtual reality. So it's now my pleasure to turn the floor to my colleague Damien on smart bordering and border walls.
Thank you very much. So I will try to go directly into the subject to try to exemplify the link between bordering and smart technologies, or so-called smart technologies, by illustrating my point with the case of the UK-EU border, and more specifically the UK-France and Belgium border. And I will try to demonstrate, of course, that what happened in this border over the last 2 years is a great digitization process, an acceleration of the digitization process that is transforming, for trade at least, the UK-France, UK-Belgium border, similar to what is also happening at the US-Mexico border in some points, with long line and queuing and blaming between the two states, especially the UK states and the French state, from time to time. So this is why I will try to demonstrate the case of digitization of the UK-EU border. In a nutshell, I will try to demonstrate that Brexit was not only about a divorce, a political divorce, it was also about a huge bordering happening with the digitization and the smart bordering process. I will try to differentiate also the fact that each relies on the evolution of one specific institutional actors in the UK, in France, and in Belgium, which are the customs. And the Brexit was an acceleration for the digitization of the customs, and also linked to the evolution of their identity as an institution. I will try to demonstrate that. I will be based, of course, my presentation on a specific research that I did during my postdoctoral time from 2019 and 2021, so during the negotiation of the Brexit deal and after, with the beginning of its implementation on the ground from 1st January 2021. And I had the chance actually to be supported in this process by the University of the Greater Region. I see Christian here, that welcomed me as guest professor, so I could take time to actually interview customs authority and look at this specific bordering process. So I will go first towards what is actually the different type of smart bordering process that were implemented by those 3 states, France, Belgium, and the UK. What were the main consequences, especially on trade and logistics, adaptation of logistics for trade. And fourth, I will try to relate that based on the interviews I conducted with customs with the evolution of the digitization of border trade. Very briefly, a bit of literature, and I'm happy here to share the panel with some specialists on smart bordering. Smart bordering, of course, is about filtering migration, filtering trade flows, and ensuring fluidity by implementing different types of mechanism of tracking and tracing. But smart bordering is not only about the virtual, it's also about the implementation of a certain number of infrastructure based on public-private cooperation, especially IT companies, but also about the interoperability, meaning the exchanges of data across national and institutional boundaries. And moreover, there have been a part of the literature in critical security studies that have been developed along the last years on the knowledge production out of the accumulation of data of what is crossing, and especially for the trade, that is based on multiple usages and sometimes competition, and even sometimes not sharing information and data. And in my case, especially at the UK-EU border, many different types of actors were using those data about trade, port authority, customs, private companies, carrier, and customs broker. Just briefly on the consequences of Brexit on the trade between the UK and the EU. So the general agreement that was implemented from January 2021 was of course based on the idea that there would be no tariff and no quota applied to the importation and exportation out and in of the UK. And mostly the cost of the bordering dealt by companies was mostly about a non-tariff cost, especially adapting to new type of exportation, especially for small companies that were not used to do that. On the short-term consequences, there was no major traffic jams, especially in January 2021, so 1.5 years ago, but there were shortages in the UK economy and adjustments of supply chains that had to adjust themselves to customs formality, especially of the goods moving out of the UK. So there have been a measurement of trade reduction after 10 months in October 2021, which of course involved a diminution of 15% of the trade. Long-term reorganization of supply chain, it's more hard, of course, now to assess. There are some specialists on logistics, like Alan McKinnon, for instance, that are trying to measure that over the period of time. But there have been, of course, according to some sectors, very specific sectors, adaptation to this new reality. Each country developed a smart bordering process or accelerated procedure of smart bordering process that were already being discussed in those three countries. In the UK adopted what it calls the border operating model. And the main question for it was its readiness. Would it be ready for the implementation of the deal, even though, of course, it was conditioned to the political discussion between the European Commission and the UK. But from 2019, the UK created specific groups that were called the border delivery groups in Belgium, in Luxembourg, in northern France and eastern France especially, to try to prepare the different type of companies to this new reality and new procedures. From 2001, the UK did not implement controls at the beginning of 2001, or it announced that it would implement a control based on different stages, from very few, only declaration of invoices and declaration of carriage, to more procedures, and especially this year, there are more introduction of phytosanitary control of what is entering into the UK, and the implementation of a specific smart border mechanism, which is the good vehicle movement service for every type of goods entering and exiting and even transiting to especially Ireland, the island of Ireland, Republic of Ireland. The main problem was to adapt the UK company to EU norms for the UK product to be exported to the EU. And there was, of course, a need for many companies to hire customs intermediary, all years, custom brokers, that were adapted, which was a new reality for many countries that were not used to do a trade with non-European countries. So we can classify this smart bordering process with all the political legislation as a learning process. But now, actually, the UK is more confident to implement this type of procedures, especially in the case of the renegotiation of the Northern Ireland Protocol that is now taking place since last week, actually, between the European Commission and the UK government. And now the UK is proposing, based on their knowledge and based especially on this good vehicle movement service, a filtering of different types of goods, especially the one going from Britain to Northern Ireland and the one going to Britain to the Republic of Ireland, and we can go back to that in this discussion. From the Belgium side, there have been more proactiveness in preparing the companies, the Belgian companies, to any kind of reality that may come out of Brexit. So there was, since 2018, at the federal state of Belgium, a Brexit high-level group and a Brexit impact scan to prepare companies, to reach out to make companies, especially small ones. And indeed, in January 2021, the custom did not report any major traffic jam, only some issues of registration of some companies that were not registered on time. And the role of custom brokers were mostly assumed by port authorities, such as Zeebrugge, for instance, or Antwerp, Anvers in French. And now the Belgian custom has worked towards the creation of a port community system, meaning a concentration of all the type of data that you need to submit that were mostly dealt by the port authority, the companies, but also the customs authority. So for them, and I'm quoting here, of course, an interview from one of the customs authority, the Brexit was an accelerator. So it was a way to generalize and centralize different type of procedures to proceed with this trade. Briefly on France, France also took the Brexit as an opportunity to accelerate the implementation of its frontières intelligentes. This is a term in French that they used, that were already developed since April 2018. And they were indeed very proactive also to prepare the company since 2018, looking at all the tax declaration to look at the company that were involved with trade with the UK. And again, they also noticed no major traffic jam initially at the beginning of 2021. Now it's a bit different. We can go back to that afterwards. And of course, for them, it was an occasion to accelerate the digitization of border trade that was planned in the European Union Customs Codes of 2013. So for them, the main issue is, of course, the articulation and the trust, again, that they could build up between themselves and the UK system. And now there have been a renewal of tensions among the two entities, especially with the implementation of the EU entry-exit system, especially in Calais and Dover, that needs to be generalized. And there are, of course, a lot of tension, especially in the ports of Calais and a line of vehicles and trade trucks that are increasing. So this is an example, for instance, of the frontier intelligence according to the French government. Just to conclude, I would try to demonstrate that Brexit is about the independence and the autonomy that the customs authority in those three countries are also building up. They have to adapt, especially on the EU side, towards EU integration and more around common norms and EU programs of digitization more generally, such as the entry-exit system, and trying actually to move towards the e-custom procedures that was already discussed since 2013 and 2016. Each country is developing a specific type of national identity regarding the customs. For instance, the French are trying to emancipate themselves from the border police, so investing the technology is for us a way to autonomize themselves and get actually more credits and more resources from the French governments. In Belgium, they try also to be basing themselves on the link that they develop with companies on the ground to wait more, especially inside the federal government. So it's a way for customs to gain autonomy from other border security actors. It's about identity making and the link that they were able to reinforce, especially with local companies. And it is also a way for each country, based on digitization of border, to create a feeling of attractivity in competing corridors, especially if you take the Calais corridor, the Zeebrugge corridor, or Le Havre corridor, for instance. So this is one of the matter, of course, of smart bordering in the region. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm now turning to Philippe on the governmentality of smart borders.
So, thank you. It's great. This is my first in-person conference since COVID, so it's a great venue to be back at. A lot of familiar faces, some that I only know virtually, so it's nice to see people in person. We've held to a long-standing academic tradition of bringing a paper with a different title than the one that you'll find in the program. That's in part due, so Phil won a SSHRC grant that is on securing the border with data, and I'm a part of it, as well as Chan Mutlu, at Acadia University. So that is recent, and that's why a lot of our work here is just kind of starting out on this. As you can see from the title, what we're approaching the question of basically the use of various forms of datification at the border in terms of a variety of failures. As you'll see in our presentation, we're talking about these all in a sense as different kinds of failures. So there's not as if there's some kind of, if only it was done in the following manner, it would succeed. That's definitely not the case. In terms, I want to go through this really quick. So we're both reflecting on a series of cases in our analysis, as well as there is already literature out there in terms of where we're at in automation, the emergence of artificial intelligence, issues of the datification, or earlier somebody mentioned the other James Scott, seeing like a state, the notion of rendering things legible. I think increasingly there's a huge move to that the issue is not necessarily about the efficacy of the actual strategy, but simply that we keep putting people into the database in some way, and then later on we can decide what it is we might want to do with that. So I'm going to pop there and hand it over, and then I'll come back.
So as you can see, the questions that we're looking at are around what does failure look like in technical systems at and around the border, but also how is failure instructive about the forms of politics that are called forward in some of these forms of border security today, and also what kinds of new forms of critique might come from that. And so one of the things that we notice when we scan through the literature is that there's obviously a very heavy EU and European emphasis in a lot of literature on smart borders and datafication, but there is also a very strong kind of underpinning in science and technology studies, both in terms of the kind of conceptual approach and grounding, but also in terms of the methods that are followed in a lot of work in this vein. So, accounting for failure. So as we've seen, and especially in the discussions this morning, what we find is that a lot of these practices and policies around border walls in fact fail, but they keep trucking on in some ways, right? They fail for some people, they function for others. So we're interested in this question of failure that is in fact central to a lot of discussions in science and technology studies in particular, and in innovation studies in many other places. It's central to some of the early works, like the work of Michel Callan, for example. And so what we have is a kind of sustained critique in STS of this kind of realist idea of failure, right? That sort of things have a kind of way of succeeding or failing objectively, and that we can identify when these things fail on those terms. And in fact, we kind of want to move in a different direction, which is to kind of acknowledge and go where the literature takes us as well, which is acknowledging this kind of socio-technical basis of a lot of these different practices. So what we find is that specifically in security studies and in analyses of biometrics and other forms of data at the border, there is a sustained interest in questions of how these technologies fail and how they persist despite this failure. And what we find is a couple of different modes of critique that are prevalent in the literature and that we identify with, but also want to move beyond. So this is the kind of final point on that slide, where we often critique technology because it doesn't work. We often critique technology because it actually works as advertised and has many negative ramifications. We also have a critique of technology that's oriented around the ways that it might work, but in unexpected ways. So this is often what gets called, especially in surveillance studies, this question of function creep, right? We have these sort of unanticipated effects and potential failures of technology. And then on the final point, we have the kind of ethical basis of a lot of these technologies, especially when we think about artificial intelligence and machine learning, where these technologies actually don't necessarily succeed or fail in traditional terms, but raise a certain bundle of ethical factors that are worth considering. So I'll turn back over to Ben.
So the first case that we look at is probably one of the sort of least fitting cases in a way, but it's arisen out of what we might consider a kind of inadvertent datification as a result of COVID-19 measures in the border and the management of COVID-19 within Canada. So Temporary Foreign Workers Program is a long-standing program in Canada, as you can see in the numbers, significant numbers of migrant laborers largely used in the agricultural industry. An issue that required a response very quickly from pressure from the industry as Canada nominally closed its borders, particularly to the south, in response to COVID-19. And so pretty quickly this had to be remedied because Canada's food security relies on it. And what you have is, so there's not a sudden kind of datification in and of itself of temporary foreign workers, but you have the datification of COVID. And regional health units start to track COVID numbers. And so what we find is strange scenarios where areas that don't necessarily have significantly high populations, don't have significant urban populations, suddenly have really elevated levels of COVID cases. And so people start asking questions. What's going on? How is this happening? And you quickly realize that this is a result of temporary foreign workers, the living conditions that are allowable, which actually in many cases render impossible any kind of social distancing. And historically, it's also a population that when suffered health issues, employers were able to simply send foreign workers back to their country of origin, which under the conditions of COVID was also not allowable. So it presents this kind of puzzle that has led to a series of policy changes, but it also actually stirred a much more vigorous public discourse about the issue. For many people in Canada, the first they kind of heard of temporary foreign workers was in relation to this, and suddenly it was on, CBC did a couple of lengthy documentaries on it. It was in the local media, and so it was this kind of inadvertent case of datification that then renders this population more legible within the system. So that's kind of our first case.
So the temporary foreign worker program, in terms of, for measuring things in terms of throughput, is a relatively efficient part of the Canadian immigration system. So I'm going to speak about a slightly less efficient part of it, which is in terms of the backlogs that are often faced in terms of visa processing, especially for permanent residency, skilled workers, and so on. And so faced with the backlogs of applications, the Canadian government, and especially the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada in particular, has been trying to bring new digital tools to try and deal with these backlogs and to try and automate certain elements of the work of visa officers in terms of determining not only eligibility but admissibility to Canada. So there's been a trial using what's called advanced data analytics, according to the Canadian government, that's been put in place in embassies in India and China to try and triage immigration applications. So the way that this is done is using past data to try and determine and present to an officer for decision what files might be eligible for consideration. So there's a lot of downplaying that happens within the government in terms of what the actual technology is doing, right? It's not making decisions, but it's making decisions in terms of triage. It is a very simple technology in terms of what it's trying to do, but in the end, actually, the government is playing up the kind of machine learning and the possibility of this technology evolving through exposure to more and more immigration data. So what we have is some interesting ways that this has been contested internally. So this is kind of part of our narrative about how this technology is working versus not working. So in the context of protests around racial justice in 2020, obviously there's a reckoning across government and some reflection in terms of what types of systemic racism or biases might exist in the system. And so what we find is that a lot of employees within the immigration ministry in Canada have this kind of critique of the application of data-intensive and potential machine learning practices, wanting to avoid this kind of entrenching of historical forms of racism, right? So if we're going to be using older data to analyze new data in the interest of avoiding bias, we then run into these problems of biases in the historical data.
Yeah, I'm going to be really quick on this one because I think it's in some cases it's a super important case, in others it's a less interesting one, because the evolution from U.S. visit to the Office of Biometric, I've lost sound, and the Office of Biometric Identity Management is basically that this has become a kind of standard in a sense for sort of global policy isomorphism, yet there is a lack of measurement in terms of efficacy. So like whether this works or not is not part of the conversation. It's not really relevant. And you see this from RAND Corporation reports, Government Accountability Office. There's the kind of discussion has more to do with the need to enhance the levels of customer service as a model within it. But beyond that, there's really not much of a conversation. So it's in a sense a failure because there's no measurement. And yet this becomes kind of the standard bearer, in a sense, that we see traveling around the world.
So we picked 4 cases despite having 10 minutes, but we'll manage. So the final case is this question of apps at the border. And so many of you who have visited Canada during the pandemic and since will have come in contact with ArriveCan, which was compulsory until only a few weeks ago to present public health information around testing, vaccination, but also to increasingly fulfill some of the kind of customs requirements for entry into Canada. So obviously there's been lots and lots of pushback from business associations, from border cities, even from the Airports Association, which is a bit unexpected given that the government wants this application to make people go faster through airports in a certain way. So there's a number of failures that have been identified here. So the first one is the pushing travelers into compulsory quarantine, even though the application has been filled out correctly. There's been some reporting in the last few weeks about the development cost, that it costs about something like 10 or 20 times more than what it was planned to cost at the beginning. And there's also some critiques from the Border Officers Union in terms of what this does to their work. And so the Border Officers Union has been adamant that this is an unnecessary application, but also that this pressure to digitalize reduces the role of their own expertise in terms of managing the border. So, very quickly, to conclude, I mentioned a couple of these critiques before, right? We have these 4 modes of critique. Either tech doesn't work, and that's why we don't like it. Either it works, and that's the problem, or it works in ways we don't anticipate and creeps into new areas of social life, or we have this kind of ethical aspects of the failure of technology. So we think that it's potentially very helpful, especially in an era in which machine learning is increasingly applied at the border in the name of AI and digitalization, to focus on the kind of recursive elements that are in place, right? How does this technology learn? How does it adapt to critique? How does it potentially fold in some of the critiques that we make, right? We've often heard about things like ethical AI and attempts to make these technologies respond to the kinds of things that we raise at conferences like this. So methodologically, this might push us to study things like what we could call the software level bureaucrat rather than the street level bureaucrat, right? Like the role of software designers, data analysts, and so on in making the border what it is today and focusing on these kind of questions of design. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is to our colleague Anna on epidermal politics.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, and thanks to Elizabeth and Adrian for organizing and hosting us in Montreal. I have to warn you about potential triggers in my presentation since it deals with quite violent forms of control related to the use of biometric data. It also refers to migrants' practices of self-harm as form of contestation of biometric control. And I would just make the point that I am the gender quota in this panel, but at least we have one. So and this paper is the result of a collaboration with my colleague Georgios Glouftsios, who couldn't be here today. Here we reflect upon migration management in Europe, and in particular about the registration of migrants and asylum seekers in large-scale biometric databases, such as Eurodac. We do this through the notion of epidermal politics, which analytically captures the ways that the human skin becomes the site of identification, knowledge production, control, and contestation. And we look at aspects of control, dissent, and violence in relation to epidermal politics. So, as we know, the power of states to know and manage mobile subjects that cross their borders and the populations inhabiting their territories depends on their capacity to produce identity records. The first part of the paper briefly discusses the emergence of the human skin as one of the most crucial and seemingly undisputable markers of identity. Here we argue that biometric borders and databases used for migration management are characterized by a sort of corporeal fetishism. Biometrics imply that knowledge of the human body, like fingertip patterns, reveals something about the human self. They do not only seek to establish the identity of an individual, they also function as passcodes that provide state authorities with access to digital files that contain various administrative information about individuals. This information can reveal, for example, when and where someone applied for asylum, when and where they applied for a visa, and so on. Data extracted from bodies and their links with such administrative information are synthesized to render individuals controllable subjects. We've been looking at the history of technologies that render skin visible and analyzable. I cannot go through all our findings, but perhaps the most gruesome early biometric technology is that of slave branding, and the branding of slaves with hot iron functioned as a biometric technology through which slaves were signified as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded. The brand served also as a technology of tracking. It made the mobility of slaves outside of the plantation traceable. Slaves who had previously escaped could be identified and returned to their owners. This means that slaves' future chances of escape were limited by the scars on their skin. Control, tracking, and subjugation became epidermal. We explain that the operational logic of biometric databases deployed in the field of migration management bears similarities with biometric technologies of the past, and specifically that of the brand. Non-European racialized bodies come to be branded with codes that give them meaning and identity, and that attach them to specific categories, like that of the irregular migrant and the asylum seeker. Racism is here a precondition for the development of biometric databases used for migration management. In the second part of the paper, we focus on how such control is enacted, and we reflect upon the various governmental rationalities that inform it. So Eurodac is the European Asylum Dactyloscopy database. It has been deployed with the purpose to facilitate the determination of the member states that are responsible for the examination of asylum applications in line with the Dublin regulation. It helps basically to determine whether an individual applied for asylum in the past or whether they have irregularly crossed the borders of a member state. A crucial part of Eurodac is its automated fingerprint identification system, AFIS, which allows the algorithmic comparison and matching of those fingerprints that authorities register as part of the asylum application process with fingerprints that have been captured and stored in the past. Put simply, Eurodac functions on a hit-no-hit basis, where a hit signifies the existence of a match established through the automated comparison between fingerprint data recorded in the central system and those transmitted by member states. Through hits, state authorities can establish whether, when, and where individuals have lodged asylum applications in the past. And if previous applications are registered, they may be deported to the country where they first applied. In the context of Eurodac, biometric control takes the form of traceability and containment. First, traceability refers to the capacity of state authorities to recreate the journeys and bureaucratic trajectories of migrants through the gathering, processing, and sharing of the digital traces that they leave behind when they encounter the state. A precondition for rendering an individual traceable is their identification, which is done through biometric matching technologies. As in the case of slave branding, fingerprinting supports mobility tracing since it allows for the reconstruction of the history of asylum seekers. Secondly, containment refers to the ways that the state authorities slow down, intercept, and redirect migrant mobilities. This is done, for example, through the application of the Dublin regulation, which requires people to apply for asylum in the first country they enter. Fingerprinting as a tactic of mobility management embraces the impossibility of blocking and spatially confining mobility. The goal of control apparatuses is not to block mobilities by building some kind of fortress Europe, but, as Tazioli highlighted, to trace, reconstruct, and ultimately to redirect it in the form of deportation. The precondition of this is the digital epidermization of migrants and asylum seekers that allows for their localization and the determination of whether and where they applied for asylum. Besides containment and deportation, biometric databases are related to practices such as prolonged detention and physical violence or threats thereof, used as tactics to coercively fingerprint migrants. Back in 2014, in response to low fingerprint registration rates in Greece and Italy, the European Commission published a set of best practices for upholding states' obligation to take fingerprints in the context of Eurodac. While most of these guidelines were about modes of counseling to persuade migrants to provide fingerprints voluntarily, it is striking that the document specifies that for the purpose and when necessary, the use of force proportionate to overcoming objection with full respect for the physical integrity and dignity of the person is appropriate. And here you have the quotation from the document. In addition, the document also contains indication about the legitimacy of longer-term retention for people who resist fingerprinting by either burning their fingers or by using glue on them, for example. So these people will be in detention until their fingers heal and it is possible to register fingerprints. We could see how, in reality, such guidelines have been translated, at least in some cases, into direct physical violence, as well as threats of violence. Indeed, a report by Amnesty International published back in 2016 revealed cases where migrants have been beaten and hit with some kind of electric shock baton. The report also presented stories of migrants who experienced sexual harassment, as well as stories of people who consented to fingerprinting after witnessing violence. The final part of the paper discusses forms of dissent to biometric control. Many asylum seekers do not want to provide their biometric data precisely because they know how that would impact their possibility to self-determine their mobility. And they are very much aware that fingerprinting makes them traceable and controllable subjects. Consent is difficult to obtain, and when consent is obtained, it is often under some form of coercion. There is one specific act of dissent that at an epidermal level exceeds biometric control, and that is fingertip burning and mutilation. There are no official reports that provide detailed information about the extent of this phenomenon, and we cannot precisely know the number of cases of migrants and asylum seekers who have injured their own skin to delimit the control capacities of the state and prevent potential future deportation. We have, although, encountered several examples of practices of dissent and resistance to biometric control. For instance, back in 2015, a group of 200 Eritrean migrants protested in Lampedusa against the practice of fingerprinting, claiming their freedom while shouting, "We are human beings." Another example of dissent is the practice of burning or mutilating fingertips. Asylum seekers are adopting this practice to prevent identification by state authorities. This made the news for the first time in Sweden back in 2004, when in a Swedish radio station, an 18-year-old asylum seeker described that he had burned his finger after applying for asylum in Italy. And you can read his testimony here. Self-directed violence in the form of fingertip burning and mutilation is a way to escape digital epidermization and a mode of self-determination. To be clear, fingertip burning and mutilation are acts of dissent within a structure of oppression. They are self-damaging and they do not completely free migrant subjects from control. However, with these practices, migrants attempt to reclaim their freedom of movement by dissociating their embodied selves from the digital epidermal traces that they have left behind when they encounter the state. So to conclude, our aim in this paper is to continue reasoning on the ways in which violence is embedded in biometric border control and to see how this forms part of a continuum of racialized epidermal politics of exclusion and monitoring of black bodies. By inquiring into the registration of migrants and asylum seekers in biometric databases like Eurodac, we reflected upon how human bodies and skin specifically become the sites of border control, violence, and dissent. Through violence, the authority is inserted on the individual bodies of people on the move. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our last presentation on hostile borders and design of virtual reality by our colleague Juan Llamas-Rodriguez.
Thank you. One thing I will note is that there's a couple of slides that you'll notice has a very brusque symbol to say not to tweet. So if you're tweeting right now, could you just not, you can take pictures for yourself, but just don't put them out on Twitter. And I can explain why after. So in the past few years, there's been a significant increase in virtual reality projects around the topic of migration, whose aim is to allow citizens of the global north to learn about and experience the plight of migrants. Much of the writing on this project has revolved around the question of empathy. Supporters argue that because of its immersiveness and realism, virtual reality allows stronger, more successful identification with the disenfranchised communities it depicts. Now, many experts have rightly criticized the central flaws of empathy thinking. As psychologist Paul Bloom argues, empathy may spotlight certain people in the here and now, making us care more about them, but it leaves us insensitive to the long-term consequences of our acts. Empathy discourse ignores how identification with the narratives plays on dominant forms of representation, including, in this case, translating the experience of migrants into victim tales that users can readily consume. Users of VR empathize with the formal structures of the narrative, not the actual people whose lives these stories are exerted. Empathy prioritizes the empathizer, not the object of empathy. So because I agree with these insights broadly, my presentation is not really dwelling on the question of empathy in VR, but instead I present an alternative form of experiencing and reflecting on these VR projects that I call reading for hostile borders. So instead of dwelling on the question of whether users empathize with an immersive story, I propose that we turn our attention to whether and how these projects replicate through their design the very norms and structures of the border regimes that they purport to critique. And I'll use just one example. Carne y Arena, the virtual reality installation created by Alejandro González Iñárritu and Emanuel Lubezki, where patrons are supposed to experience in 6.5 minutes the trials of crossing the US-Mexico border through a VR immersive story based on personal anecdotes collected by the director from people who have migrated in this manner. So those who have not had to travel the Sonoran Desert are able to fantasize about what is about to by participating in the installation structure experience. I analyze how the exhibition spaces of Carne y Arena in particular contradict its purported aims for migration justice. Focusing on the design of the installation rooms, I demonstrate how it formally reinforces normative bordering logics, even while narratively bemoaning the enforcement of such logics in the outside world. Ultimately, Carne y Arena asks us to feel as migrants while avoiding any reflection on the structures that render migrants precarious, and on ours, the participants' implications in such structures. So if people haven't tried Carne y Arena, I'll briefly give you a sense of the structure of it. It consists of 3 main rooms. In the first room, you go in, you take off your shoes and your socks, and you place them in a locker. You wait for an alarm to go off, and then you proceed to the main VR stage, which is mostly totally dark. And it's covered in sand. This is where you get the VR backpack and you put on the headphones, and then you go through the sort of 6-minute story. And then in the last room, it's sort of this long corridor where you can find the stories of the various migrants that inspired the VR film. And then if you so feel, there's a guest book that you can sign at the end about how the experience changed your life. In the interest of time, I'm only going to delve on one of the rooms, namely the first room, or the antechamber. So this is one of those slides. Before entering the main room, you must pass through this small room with white walls and a low ceiling. There are 6 metallic benches spread out across the space. Thrown across the floor are objects left behind in the deserts: a toddler's sandals, improvised canteens, slippers made out of rag and twine. The black writing on the white walls tells us that these are the exact sneakers that have been found in the desert by humanitarian activists. So this room mimics the holding cells colloquially known as hieleras, or ice boxes, where US Border Patrol agents detain captured migrants for days as they await decisions on their fates. The conditions in these hieleras are so inhumane that many migrants refer to them as an ordeal worse than the harrowing border crossing. The unbearable temperatures of these cells have contributed to the deaths of a number of migrant children. Presumably, participants in the installation recognized the setup of this room from the countless reports on these precarious conditions. And here you can see a review that sort of gestures towards this. Considered as an exhibition space, namely an antechamber to the main audiovisual feature, the room speaks to the conditioning process of the spectator users. It is a place where the user's body acclimates in anticipation to the main feature. Its design works on the participants by forcing them to confront a set of behavioral parameters and restricted bodily movement. if you will, a border epistemology. So it does this in two ways. First is through the environmental conditions of the space. So the room inside is actually colder than the preceding room and than the VR room. Its wide walls only exacerbate the sort of cold, antiseptic feel. The metallic benches further absorb your heat once you've taken off your shoes and your socks. Sitting quietly on the metallic bench in a cold room without shoes or socks, the user remains in a momentary state of discomfort as their body adjusts to this new environment. So here's the second mode that the room fosters a logic of restricted bodily movement, and that is through waiting. So after you've taken off your shoes and your socks and you put the belongings in your locker, you must wait. You wait for an alarm to go off and for the red light to tell you that you can move on to the next room. Users know they will be allowed to move to the next room, but they don't know when. In the 30 seconds between when the user is ready to move on and when the attendants sound the alarm, sort of replicates a period of uncertainty that any and many border crossing instances instantiate. As we know, a border can be considered a waiting act because it causes a standstill, a difference in time and space. They're sort of waiting for that final border as you go through wait periods, visa processing times, and so forth. Through waiting, the border becomes an in-between zone regulated by processes of ordering. The different temporalities of waiting thus produce subjectivities at the border. The most privileged bodies get to move faster, while the least privileged are held indefinitely. Now, waiting in this first room will inevitably be felt different by different users. For instance, those who have been subjected to secondary inspection at an airport because of their name, skin color, accent, or citizenship in some ways already understand this kind of border practice of waiting. These users may be reminded of such spaces in the waiting period to be allowed into the VR room. In contrast, those who have never been through a secondary inspection at a border checkpoint, those for whom borders rarely been limiting structures, may be unfamiliar with the specifics of spatial regulation instantiated by border bureaucracies. So what I'm getting at here is that there is a potential for a sort of critical reflection on borders if participants can connect the brief experience in this room to broader structural social factors. However, the installation script doesn't really facilitate such critical engagement, and it kind of just puts it on and ignores it in favor of the VR experience. It has to be a sort of critical orientation that us as users bring in. So analyzing carne arena by reading for hostile borders counters the installation's obstinate need to foreground empathy as their driving point of connection. This shift in critical perspective allows us to attend to how the project replicates in its design the very protocols of border bureaucracies. Considering such bordering practices as formal elements and as design choices, I think illustrates the structural components that make borders violent. And violent here means not only the ways that we know borders are themselves violent on migrants, but also how borders undo bodily habits and redo subjectivities. How border infrastructure not only shape the circulation of bodies across straight lines, but also perceptively mold the bodies themselves. Through their formal design, borders become the physical product of state power because they give shape to this power through the built environment. So I propose rethinking the bordering practices within carne arena because the quote-unquote migration issues that it purports to address can't really be solved by caring more for migrants, but actually by thinking very critically about the structural issues that make migration a quote-unquote problem. Any well-meaning media project that attempts to address migration issues while neglecting structural disparities will only end up reaffirming the feelings of its already privileged users. Reading for hostile borders in VR projects better foregrounds the user's particular body comportment and thus provide better avenues to the interrogation of the violence of borders rather than the narrative sort of empathetic appeal that most of these projects attempt to do. And in particular, the sort of alternative reading of carne arena here foregrounds the irony inherent in the installation's reliance on border enforcement at the same time that it bemoans the violence of borders elsewhere. Critical reflection on these body regiments, in turn, could articulate more clearly the violence inherent in contemporary border practices. And that, I think, is a much better starting point for a widespread public social change. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. An interesting panel on the use of technology and smart borders from international economic relations to management of epidemics, and finally migration policy and resistance. I'm now turning to the audience. We have about 15 minutes for discussion. Please don't hesitate to have this discussion with our panelists. Thank you.
Just a question for Philip Frowd and Ben Muller with regard to one very specific aspect of the presentation. That's ArriveCAN. You know, you're focusing on the failures, the setbacks, and so on that many of these programs have had, and I just noticed that you brought up 4 major points there, but there's a few other points that I would like to suggest that you consider as well. And one of these, of course, is Canadian concerns about privacy on the one hand and data grabs on the other hand. And to what extent has ArriveCAN been recognized as a bit of a data grab? You know, it's just tried to accumulate all sorts of additional information. And then there's also another dimension that I think is important here, and that is something like ArriveCAN is treating Canadians like Americans. And Canadians don't like being treated like Americans. And so what this is doing is it's an equalization process. And my sense is that the government needs to be very aware of those kinds of shall we call them softer sides of the situation when it comes to developing these programs, especially when they're as expensive as ArriveCAN was. Thanks.
So I wanted to put Anna and your name is Juan, is that right? So Anna and Juan's paper in dialogue, because I really liked them. So the first was, I wanted to ask Anna about this idea of body comportment and about the word that he used, body comportment, right? The kind of the way that we use our bodies in space as opposed to the body itself. And I was curious as to whether or not your discussion of skin, what he said makes you rethink the ways in which the skin might also be used as a site of violence or oppression or so forth, meaning following on his presentation. And I wanted to ask the same of Juan, which is to say, I really liked the discussion of dissent that came out of Anna's talk. And I was curious, what would body comportment, how would you dissent in that space? What would it mean to dissent against the kind of structural oppression that these spaces create? So just to put them in dialogue, maybe that was clear, I don't know.
So I would like to thank all of the panelists because I think it's very interesting the ways that you bridge together the way that borders and walls interact with flows of all kinds, people and goods, and we always tend to treat them differently. So I think that was a very important thing that went all through all of them, and the way that Anna especially, you treated humans and human skin, I mean objectification and reducing the human people to their skin objectifies them in very much. So I think there are many, I mean, I don't think it's a question, it's more of a comment, but I think it's very important. We always criticize borders as in the way they impair human mobilities, and that is done through a lot of calculation and technologies that in fact are being built up to manage goods. This is what you showed, Damien, and we never react until it's maybe too late.
Thank you so much. This was an interesting panel. My question's for the Frowd and Muller paper. And I was wondering really about the last element of the presentation, when there was the discussion of engaging with the kind of recursive elements of machine learning and migration policy. And that reminded me of an earlier point you had made about RAND reports and others not engaging with metrics or measurement in any capacity. So I guess my question is there, on what basis and by what metrics, ethical or otherwise, should those recursive elements be scrutinized moving forward? So, thank you.
Yes, let's take that last one.
Thank you so much for all the presentation. I have two specific questions. One is about the, sorry, I forgot your name, about the fingerprints. No, you, yeah. To me, was really important how you related the historical, how marked the people who was enslaved in plantation with the current ways to control migration. So I don't know if you can detail more about this relation between the labor control and the control of mobility in plantations and the current way of control people in Maryland. And the second question is about the carne, well, the Iñárritu. One question is about, I see that many of the campaigns against anti-migrant ideologies is about that the people is ignorant or you have learned about the others, but well, at least my point of view, many times it's not about ignorance, it's about like hate or other sentiments or ideologies. So what are, in your opinion, what are the limitation of or contradiction about these campaigns or these projects about the people should learn about the other? No? Thank you.
So let's start with maybe Philippe and Benjamin, for the first question. And maybe you could try to answer to the question addressed to you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, on the topic of ArriveCAN, this is very interesting from the privacy standpoint because the application is a collaboration between the Canada Border Services Agency, but also the Public Health Agency of Canada. And so as a result of that, we sort of can already see the kind of expansion of the logic of public health into this realm of border security and vice versa as well. And so I don't know the extent to which the application is a straightforward data grab, but there's certainly a kind of mixing of data and a mixing of rationales, especially with the Quarantine Act and the heavy fines and enforcement behind the provision of data that certainly leads to a much more coercive use of software than we've seen previously from the Canadian government in a bunch of different ways. This has been recognized, but largely by activists, journalists, and researchers, not so much by the typical sources of critique of ArriveCAN, which have focused mostly on the convenience and cost kinds of questions. And that fundamentally is actually what has been the, let's say, in quote marks, the downfall of ArriveCAN, even though it continues to live on and will live on in future apps for customs declarations and so on. On the second point about treating Canadians like Americans, I think this is a very helpful observation because I think we're used to seeing the Border Services Agency in particular functioning in the shadows, not necessarily nefariously, but doing things like risk analysis in ways that are kind of hidden away from us. And when we actually come face to face with the need to provide data, we actually see what's actually happening. It opens up the black box in a certain way. So I think this question of treating Canadians like Americans is interesting. I think it's also worth maybe adding to this the question of treating Canadians like non-Canadians, right? I think we already have a heavy fingerprinting and biometric requirements for everybody who's not visa exempt. And so I think anything that moves in that direction for Canadian citizens is automatically the subject of a lot of suspicion and resistance. On the final point, I think about metrics and what basis should we use to judge some of these technologies, I think that's a very challenging question, especially when we think about sort of the ethical basis that we might use to judge these technologies. I think here it's helpful maybe to follow perhaps some of the insights that people like Louisa Moore have suggested around kind of not so much judging the technologies based on their production and their efficiency, but in fact judging the types of politics that they might open or rather might close down. I think that's probably a good, not necessarily a good way to have a scorecard for these technologies, but a helpful way to think about what they do to society more generally. I realize it's a big question, but that's what I have.
Just really quickly, so on the ArriveCan, I think another dimension to this too is there's the endless dream of further and further pre-clearance notions, right? That, I mean, like folks generally don't just show up to airports, they get into a process, and so like officials know what's happening ahead of time. Whereas, you know, someone wakes up and says, I'm gonna go shopping in Buffalo today, and they show up, and so ArriveCan is this little, like, you know, it's a candy, it's the bait and switch thing that always happens, at least at our border in many cases. It's like, here's efficiency, speed, and so on. Just give us a little something for you to get that. So I think there's that dimension. The last point, I think, like, not really anything substantive on what Phil has said, but I think the other point I would say is that there's a way, and I'll speak for myself in terms of how I approach this research. So I'm not approaching it with any kind of like delusions I have about my own role as some kind of objective analysis or something. This is like, I'm engaged in politics. I'm incredibly displeased, like actually I'm like absolutely livid by much of what I'm seeing, and I'm engaging in my research with that in mind. So when I'm looking at these technologies or looking at, you know, the countless virtual walls that I would say, like, I mean, in terms of, you know, Canada and the US even, I mean, we've got walls. We may not see them, but they're there. And there's alleged trust between our societies, but there's a lot of those things that are bubbling under and can be just as dangerous in a sense. And so I'm sort of not asking it in that same way. I would say I'm looking at this to, in fact, make an ethical point about that there's an alternate way to actually manage this. And one of those might be to say that, you know, again, I don't know why, maybe it's because there is a James Scott here that we keep thinking of James Scott seeing like a state, but like the subtitle of the book is like how certain schemes like to improve the human condition fail. And the sovereign state is sort of the chief target there. And I would say he and many others have effectively demonstrated that that is a disastrous failure. And what we see at our borders is kind of the byproduct of that. So in a way, like, we're sort of just like putting the icing, like all these things are on top of the already failure that we have, which is the sovereign state.
To Matthew, if I got your question, well, the issue of the bodily component is indeed key in this work we've done with Georgios, in that the very idea of epidermal politics is based on this reasoning that we've been doing on the body as the site of control, and that brings control and border control with it when moving around. So it has a lot to do with bodies and their movements. And as I said, or maybe I didn't because I've been cutting a lot my presentation to stay in the 10 minutes, given it the impossibility to block mobility, the issue is not anymore to stop people, but to create ways, and the biometric system of data collection is part of it, to relocate, redirect, push back, create these circular paths sometimes that somehow end up regulating mobility and creating these new forms of injustice, if I may say, that it's not just not allowing people to enter Europe, for example, but also entails these difficulties in carrying on a path that is a desired path, that is continuously, again, redirected somehow with tools, technological tools that directly affect the body. So its very movement becomes somehow a source of control management. And this relates indeed to Iñárritu's project and the final presentation. I also have the luck, maybe, or not, to go to the exhibition because it was open in Milano. And it was very disturbing, and I know people who got sick when they went to see it, especially in the confrontation with police, border police, people would faint or call for help in many cases. And I think that the part that of the exhibition, I was very, very critical about it. I'm glad there's some reflection on it, because I've heard very positive comments in general. But it was interesting, this idea of making you wait, making you turn back, and somehow making you feel this relocation, this impossibility of having a trajectory that you choose, but it's always somehow, it always encounters authorities in some ways. So there is indeed some connection. And I also go to the final question. I don't know the name of the person who asked it, but I want to thank you, because I really cut that part on the origin, let's say, of biometric technologies. I didn't say, for example, that the development of these technologies has been seen by other authors, not just by us, like Simone Cole or Simone Brown as well, as enmeshed historically with relations of power and subjugation. According to Simone Cole, for example, the first system of fingerprint identification was implemented in colonial India, where the British administrators would start fingerprinting natives who were suspected of collective pensions by impersonating deceased pensioners. And Simone Brown, in this wonderful book called Dark Matters, it builds upon Fanon's theory of epidermization that we also build upon. And she writes, and I'm quoting, that the brand denoted the relation between the black body and its owner, and branding was a racializing act. By making blackness visible as commodity and therefore sellable, branding was a dehumanizing process of classifying people into groupings, producing new racial identities that were tied to a system of exploitation, end quote. And this somehow reflects present practices of classification of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants that happens through their identification with biometric data. And the second point of connection regards traceability. So the tracking of slaves and of the mobility of slaves that happen through branding is somehow parallel to the tracking of migrants through the collection of the biometric data. So the point is, if there's a match between biometric data that have been collected by the first country of arrival and data collected by another country, when the person encounters the state in another country, the person is relocated the same way slaves were brought back to their owners, thanks to the branding. So this is how we see the connection.
I think, so I'll start with the last question about the sort of limitations to learning about the other 3VR projects. And I also have heard a lot of positive comments about Carne Arena, and I think, and I didn't show the pictures, but also if you look at the guest book afterwards, you just have pages and pages and pages of saying how like this was so powerful, and I wish the Republican Party could just go through this and then things would be better. And part of that is because all of these VR projects are set up, they're really expensive, and they're set up in a way where the audience that will come and experience them is a self-selecting audience that will sort of reaffirm the thing that they're already trying to portray, right? So Carne Arena, you're paying $50 to $100 to go watch a 6-minute film. You really just have the time and the money and the privilege to just do that and sort of get your thrills through that in some ways. So there is very much a very limited audience for who these projects are done. And the UN invests a ton of money in this because the most effective use of these kind of VR projects is through solicit donations. So the best thing you can do is have someone run through the 6-minute thing, feel really bad about migrants in that moment, and then charge them something. And they'll donate. And they've shown that that's the most effective way to just get donation for any kind of cause. Afterwards, there's no sense that that person will actually change anything or do anything or get involved in actually making any change at the policy level. It's really just feeding into what Lisa Nakamura calls feeling good about feeling bad in that sort of experience. So that's very much the sort of limited aspect of it. To the question about dissent in these spaces, so I will explain part of why I ask people not to tweet those images is that when you go through Carne Arena, they do ask you not to take pictures, and I took pictures. And I've done this 5 times now when it was at LACMA, when it was in Mexico City, it was in Dallas earlier this year. So I've done it multiple times, and I try out something different every single time. And this is part of a tradition of performance theory and play, where it is, you don't actually subscribe to the thing as they're telling you to do it, but as you're sort of testing the boundaries is how you get to learn about the thing. So in one of those, I didn't take off my shoes and my socks. I kind of was just walking around as if I was in the museum looking at the shoes that they had in the corner, just running out the time. And eventually the attendants got really mad at me, and over the speaker, they were like, you need to take off your shoes and socks and sit down on the bench. So they themselves took on the same sort of borderland argument. Like, you're not obeying the very simple task that we told you to do, and you're not allowed to move until you sort of follow that specific task. So I tried that. It asked you to, at another time, I actually interviewed one of the attendants to ask if everyone did take off their socks and shoes, and they said no, but at some point we have others, so we just have to let them through. So they'll let people into the other building, to the other room, with their shoes on, or with their socks on, like not completely bare feet. So there are ways of thinking about, like, how dissent works is if there is a critical practice of engaging with these spaces and actually taking the carne arena as like, this is the border regime, how do you push back against it? I think it's a more fruitful, critical stance than subscribing to it. And the only thing that we can learn from it is how to feel bad about the migrants on screen. And I think someone mentioned about the sort of, if you're already predisposed to not care for people who are not you, right, for non-citizens or for migrants, you go in and you can actually probably get your thrills from seeing the migrants sort of suffering at the hands of border police, which is what you see in those sort of 6 minutes. Because identification, all the work on identification and moving image is that you already are bringing in sort of your values into it. There is no magical film or VR or anything that will change your locus of identification in that particular period of time. So if you're already, you could actually go, and if you're really pro Border Patrol, go and experience it really well, because Border Patrol acts very violently in the film, and just sort of buy into that narrative as well.
Perfect, thank you.